At the time, I told my immediate and distant superiors that my belief was that Richard Chase now was doing things with small animals and birds, killing them, drinking their blood, and that he would graduate to larger animals and eventually to people.
What images appear in your mind when you hear the word vampire? A gothic creature with a Hungarian accent, or do images of handsome men that sparkle in the sunlight conjure up in your mind? As the saying goes, truth is stranger than fiction. In the 1970s, a young man consumed with paranoia let his thoughts possess him into becoming a real-life Dracula. Tonight on Frycrave, we journey through the blood-soaked life and crimes of the vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase. So who was Richard Chase? What led him to commit one of the worst killing sprees in California's history? Was it nature or nurture? What causes a man to murder 6 people within a month's span? Let's begin with his early years. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23rd, 1950. He was brought into this world by Richard Sr. and his mother Beatrice in Sacramento, California. Little is known about Richard's early years, but it is believed he was abused by his own father. It is said he was force-fed until he vomited, and young Richard was thrown into a wall on another occasion by his father. His sister Pamela described their household as strict and sometimes physical. What is known for sure is that his mother Beatrice noted that she found dead cats in her flower boxes. Cats were missing in the neighborhood, and by later behavior, it is believed that this was the work of a young Richard Chase. It is said that Richard has shown all the traits of what is known as the McDonald Triad. The McDonald Triad is a set of 3 behaviors found within future violent offenders. Those traits are animal cruelty or killing, fire setting, and bedwetting. Many serial killers have described exhibiting one or more of these traits within their youth. By 1962, Richard Sr. and Beatrice's marriage was on the rocks, but it seemed that young Richard was normal. Besides the belief Richard may have killed neighborhood cats, he did appear to be a normal child. He would go from what could be described as an eccentric child to an adult who would live every day in a paranoia-induced torment brought on by several mental illnesses. Upon beginning high school, Richard's grades would begin going downhill. By the time he was a sophomore, he was receiving F's on all his report cards. Around this time, he also began setting fires and committing petty theft. During his early life, he didn't exhibit many signs of schizophrenia, but upon reaching adulthood, it would be apparent he in fact did. These signs didn't appear until he began attempting to have sexual relationships. Richard had no problem getting romantic partners. His problem was being able to sustain an erection in the bedroom. It became common knowledge among his peers that Richard wasn't able to achieve an erection. Unknowingly at the time, this would become the catalyst of his schizophrenic delusions. Richard began seeing a psychiatrist for his sexual problems, but finding the solution was more important to him than what was causing it. The cause for Richard's impotence was likely suppressed anger towards women. He thought he could find a way to simply solve his problem. This is when he discovered that a penis becomes a wreck due to it filling up with blood in health class. Then the walls of reality began to crumble around Richard. Richard's brain began to deteriorate due to untreated and undiagnosed schizophrenia. After hearing the lecture in health class, Richard assumed his body needed more blood. His way of replenishing his body was to simply drink the blood of animals. Richard would then steal a kitten from his girlfriend's house so he could kill the animal and drink its blood. His thirst for blood would continue as he killed a dog with a .22 caliber pistol to indulge in his ever-growing bloodlust. Richard was already in an intense state of paranoia. This would escalate after he began experimenting with drugs. His drugs of choice were marijuana, LSD, and amphetamines. The use of these drugs on his already deteriorating mental state just increased his paranoia and delusions. Richard stopped showering and refused to wash his clothes. In a home he shared with 2 other people, Richard barricaded himself within his bedroom closet. After being forced out of said closet, he was asked why he had done it. His reasoning was to prevent anyone from sneaking up on him from the inside. Richard's friend circle began to dissipate, as they began to abandon him, leaving him to his own devices. He was sent to live with his recently divorced mother, Beatrice. Richard's bizarre behavior continued, as he began experiencing awful fits of hypochondria. He believed his heart would stop beating periodically, his stomach had turned backwards, his bones were beginning to grow out of the back of his skull. Throughout 1972, Richard would rack up multiple traffic violations. This led to him being arrested, for which he claimed he was gassed by the police. Richard's paranoia began to increase at a very alarming rate. After being passed back and forth by his parents, he was sent to live with his grandmother. She was able to get Richard a job driving for a bus for the mentally handicapped, but this was short-lived. He was fired reportedly because he refused to clean the bus or change its oil. Richard's grandmother described strange behavior from her grandson during his stay with her. She witnessed Richard doing handstands in a bizarre attempt to get blood to travel to his head. On another occasion, she saw him wrap a towel full of sliced oranges around his head for unknown reasons. Within a little under a year of living with his grandmother, he was sent back to live with his mother. Richard's hallucinated health conditions led to him repeatedly calling emergency services. On one instance, a paramedic suggested that Richard needed psychiatric help. Beatrice then checked her son into American River Hospital to receive mental treatment. There, Richard would be diagnosed as a schizophrenic and was given the option for inpatient care and treatment. His mother would ignore doctor's recommendation and take him home. Upon arriving home, though, his delusions worsened. Now he believed his food was being poisoned. On top of his severe delusions, his behavior began becoming very violent and sadistic. Richard took the family dog and cut its paws, and squeezed its jaw, nearly breaking it. He was then sent to live by himself, given an allowance, and to live in an apartment on his own. Richard would spend a lot of his time traveling on bike to pick up rabbits. He would take them home to kill and butcher to eat pieces of raw. Sometimes he would take the entrails and blood of the rabbits, place them into a blender to make a vile smoothie concoction. He believed that by doing this, it would prevent his heart from shrinking and deteriorating. This behavior very much resembles what is known as Cotard syndrome, a disorder that causes someone to believe they are already dead, rotting from the inside, or they are missing blood or internal organs. It is also possible that Richard had Renfield syndrome, also known as clinical vampirism. This causes the person inflicted to become excited at the sight of blood and or become sexually aroused by seeing or intaking blood. It is believed that many killers have had Renfield syndrome, such as Peter Curtin, the vampire of Dusseldorf. On April 25, 1976, Richard's father would pay him a visit. He would horrifically discover his son was pale and very ill. Richard claimed he had food poisoning from eating raw rabbit meat. In reality, it was discovered he had blood poisoning after he had injected himself with the blood of the rabbits he was picking up. Richard would be admitted to a mental hospital where he would receive the nickname Dracula.
I've noticed you're nodding yes as Art talks. Is that the way you feel?
Pretty much the same way. That he needed extensive care. He was not receiving as much care as he should have gotten, or could have gotten. And the whole thing is just a tragedy.
The nickname came to be because he would almost exclusively talk about killing animals and blood. On June 20th, a housekeeper discovered the decapitated bodies of 2 birds outside of Richard's room. Richard had taken the birds, ripped their heads off, and covered himself in their blood. Upon being confronted about the incident, he tried to explain that the blood simply came from cutting himself while shaving. He would be released from the hospital in September. With the assistance of medication, his behavior slightly increased. However, his mother would unfortunately begin to wean him off of the medicine. Her reasoning was that she thought Richard acted zombie-like. By January of 1977, Richard was once again completely unmedicated and stopped seeing his psychiatrist on a regular basis. At this point, Richard began taking illegal drugs again. He had also begun taking on more vampiric characteristics, such as sleeping during the day and roaming at night. His thirst for blood would continue as he killed 2 dogs and a cat. On August 3, 1977, police were alerted to an abandoned 1966 Ford Ranchero near Pyramid Lake, Nevada. Upon approaching the vehicle, they saw its bumper sticker reading, "I'd rather be flying." They soon realized the vehicle was not abandoned. Richard Chase was close by, sitting on a rock in the scorching sun and intense heat, nude and covered in blood. He had driven 200 miles away from Sacramento, and he was around half to a quarter mile away from his vehicle. As Richard was away from his vehicle, the officers began to check it out. They found a .22 caliber pistol, a .30-30 lever action rifle, and bloody clothing. Upon looking in the car's floorboard, they discovered a bucket filled to the brim with blood and a liver within its depths. Police then spotted Richard sitting on the rock with a pair of binoculars. They decided to pursue him. Richard then began to run away, and a chase ensued. The officers were able to apprehend him. They asked Richard why he was covered in blood. He responded saying that it was seeping from him. The liver and blood were later tested, and it was confirmed to have belonged to a cow. He was then released to his father without any prosecution or charges. Within a mere 4 months, Richard's bloodlust would escalate as he would attempt to take the life of Dorothy Polinsky. On December 27, 1977, Dorothy was at home doing dishes when the sound of breaking glass alerted her. Richard had fired his .22 caliber pistol at her head. Miraculously, the bullet went through the tightly done bun she had in her hair and struck a cabinet. She had not seen Richard, which made it near impossible to capture the perpetrator who attempted to take her life. Just 2 days after the attempted murder of Dorothy Polinsky, Richard would strike again, and tragically would be successful this time. Richard's bloodlust would continue at the expense of 51-year-old engineer Ambrose Griffin. On December 29th, Ambrose Griffin returned home from the grocery store with his wife Carol and daughter-in-law Gail. The time struck a little past 8:30 p.m. as the family were carrying their groceries inside. All was quiet as Ambrose went to grab the last of the groceries. At the same time, the vampire of Sacramento was looking to take someone's life. Richard pulled up in his car and fired twice at Ambrose. The first shot missed, but the second shot struck Ambrose in the chest and he fell to the ground, and Richard sped off into the night. Ambrose's wife, Carol, originally believed the gunshots were just backfire of a car passing by and that her husband was having a heart attack. Ambrose Griffin would be pronounced dead later that night, and with little leads, the case went cold. On January 23rd, 1978, Richard would leave his home once again with intentions to kill. This is when he decided to approach the home of Jean Layton on foot. Jean was at home watching television as Richard attempted to enter her home. Much like a vampire, if there wasn't an opportunity to enter the home, he would attempt to find an entrance. Richard never just broke into homes. If there was a door or a window unlocked, he would just enter the home. If not, he would simply leave. The front door of Gene's home was locked, so he went to the windows. The windows were also locked, so he decided to enter through the back door. Gene heard a noise at the back of her house and decided to investigate. She was met face to face with Richard on her back porch. He blurted out, "Excuse me," to Gene, who was fast to call law enforcement. Richard simply waited there as if Gene was supposed to open the door for him. Eventually, he lit a cigarette and merely walked away, losing all interest in what he was about to do. Chase then approached the Edwards residence and entered through a back window. Thankfully, they were not home. But Richard was not going to leave empty-handed. Richard decided he was going to burglarize the place, but he would also do things not usually common for normal burglars. After loading a bag full of the family's belongings, he decided to urinate into a drawer of clothes. He then decided to defecate into the baby's crib. Little did Richard know that the family was about to arrive. The Edwards family returned to see Richard in the act. Mr. Edwards then chased Richard out of the home and down the street, causing him to drop the belongings. After being chased away from the home, Richard then arrived at a local store around 11:45 a.m. the same day. Upon entering the store, he ran into a former high school classmate named Nancy. Richard immediately began acting strange towards Nancy. He asked her if she was on the motorcycle the day one of their classmates, Kurt, had crashed and tragically passed away. A bit weirded out, assumingly, she simply answered no. Randomly in the middle of the conversation, he walked away, just for him minutes later to continue the odd conversation. Nancy began paying for her things, and Richard continued talking, as she noticed a strange yellowish substance around his mouth. She walked out of the store to her vehicle to head home, as Richard followed. Nancy then got into the vehicle and sped off as he attempted to open the door. What he was planning to do is unknown. After being left by Nancy, Richard began walking behind the store to a home close by. That was the home of Teresa Wallin. Earlier that morning, 22-year-old Teresa Wallin would buy groceries in the same store. It is unknown if Richard saw her earlier that day, because sometimes killers like Richard create patterns where they seemingly do not exist. Teresa was home alone that day, as the vampire of Sacramento decided to strike once again. Teresa was cleaning as Chase approached the home. Unfortunately, her front door was unlocked. Richard pulled his gun out of its shoulder holster, cocked it, and placed the empty shell into her mailbox. As Teresa went to take the garbage out, Richard entered the home. He fired 3 times. The first bullet went through the palm of her hand as she went to protect herself, and exited through her elbow, glancing her cheek. The second shot hit her cheek, breaking her jaw, and the last shot pierced her brain. Richard then decided to take his crime a step further. He put a pair of rubber gloves on and grabbed a knife from the kitchen. He then dragged Teresa's body into a rear bedroom and pulled up her skirt. Richard then began to mutilate her body by slicing off her left nipple and plunging the knife into her stomach. He punctured her stomach so hard it split her sternum open. Richard then proceeded to slice open the left side of Teresa's stomach, pulled out the intestines, and exposed internal organs. Richard then stabbed at her organs 8 times. One of the stab wounds exited her back. He then picked up a yogurt cup out of the trash to fill it with her blood. He drank the cup of blood and smeared it on his face. As he exited the home, he saw a pile of dog feces. He picked it up and re-entered the crime scene. Richard then took the feces and shoved it in Teresa's mouth and left as nothing had happened. It would later be discovered that Teresa was pregnant at the time of her tragic death. Later that day, Teresa's husband returned home from work to discover the horrific scene. Law enforcement would arrive soon after, and an investigation commenced. The investigation was headed by seasoned investigator Lieutenant Ray Biondi. Biondi vowed to capture Teresa's murderer, reportedly saying, "We need to hurry and capture this sick son of a bitch who did this." The unfortunate truth, however, is that Ray knew the perpetrator would kill again. For the detectives, it became a race against the clock. There was surprisingly little evidence to be had. The little evidence they really had was that the killer either brought a bucket with him or had stolen one from the house, and the empty bullet shell that was placed in the mailbox. A mere 2 days later, however, a Labrador puppy had been shot to death with a .22 caliber pistol. The perpetrator was described as a skinny male who matched the description of a man who had been going door to door asking for copies of Mad magazine. Biondi saw this as a potential lead. Unfortunately, law enforcement were far from getting their man, as the investigation into Teresa Wallin's murder continued. Richard would strike again. 4 days later, on January 27th, the vampire Sacramento would strike once more, and this would be a complete massacre. 36-year-old Evelyn Miroth was at home with her son Jason and a friend named Daniel Meredith. Her sister-in-law's 20-month-old baby was also at the home. She was planning on sending her son to play with a neighbor's kid near the Sierra Nevada mountains. She had sent Daniel Meredith to the store to pick up snowshoes for her son. The exact order of events that were about to occur are not known for certain, but this is what is believed to have happened. Richard entered through the unlocked back door as Evelyn was bathing. He entered the bathroom and shot Evelyn in the head. Her son Jason presumably heard the noise and went to see what had just happened. Richard then shot the young boy twice in the head, then returned to Evelyn's body to drag it to the bedroom. He then placed Evelyn onto the bed and dragged her son into the bedroom as well. Richard went to the kitchen to grab a knife to begin mutilating as he had done once before. As Daniel Meredith returned to the home, Richard would then shoot Daniel between the eyes, killing him. He would then hear the crying of a baby in another room. Richard then approached the baby laying in a crib and shot him in the head. He would return to Evelyn's body with a knife in hand. Richard would then slice open Evelyn's stomach down to her navel, remove her intestines, and stab at her internal organs like he had done before, repeating the same type of mutilation. Richard then sliced off a piece of her liver and ate it. He collected as much blood from Evelyn as he could into a bucket, and then sodomized her body. He would finish mutilating Evelyn's body by slitting her throat and removing one of her eyes. This is when he returned to the deceased baby boy and removed him from the crib. He then carried the child to the bathroom and split the baby's head open, partially spilling brain matter into the bathtub. There was a knock at the door. It was the neighbors, who'd been waiting on Jason to come out and play. Richard waited for them to leave. He then took the keys to Daniel Meredith's station wagon and fled the scene with a bucket of blood and the baby's corpse. The gruesome scene would be discovered 30 minutes later by the neighbors, who discovered Daniel's body in the hallway. Richard abandoned the stolen station wagon 100 yards away from his apartment complex and went home. Lieutenant Ray Biondi decided to do something differently in this investigation into Richard Chase. He was going to use psychological profiling, a technique he had learned from an FBI seminar 2 years prior. Biondi used evidence discovered at the crime scenes and a few hunches to come up with a profile on the perpetrator to create a psychological profile. This is what he came up with. 1. The neighborhoods of the crimes primarily contained a Caucasian population, and that a minority would have been noticed. The primary suspect was a skinny Caucasian male in his 20s. 2. The killer suffered from schizophrenia. The killings were disorganized and occurred during the day with little to no effort to cover up his actions. 3. The perpetrator was a loner. He was unmarried with no job. It was unlikely the killer would have a job due to the brutality of the crimes and the fact that they took place during average working hours. 4. The perpetrator had little to no social skills. 5. The The killer had been released from a mental institution in a recent time frame. This is due to the brutal nature of the crimes as well. The profile Ray came up with matched Richard very accurately. The problem was there still wasn't enough proof to arrest him. This is when Nancy came forward with her story. After Richard's crimes came to light, and seeing a police sketch of the killer, Nancy decided to speak to her father-in-law, who was a police officer, about the odd occurrence. After speaking about the odd encounter, on a strong hunch, Biondi decided it was time to check out Richard Chase. He went through Richard's record and saw an unsealed weapon arrest, the accounts of his violent behavior at a mental institution, and the arrest at Pyramid Lake. On January 28th, police decided to pay Richard a visit. Upon arriving at Richard's apartment, they knocked on his door to no response. The officers heard him moving around inside, so they knew he was in there. So they decided to pretend to leave to potentially lure him out. Richard walked out carrying a cardboard box. The officers yelled at him to stop. Richard then threw the box at them, causing bloody tissue paper to fly out. They began to chase him around the building, one officer in pursuit and another going the opposite direction, where he met him face to face. The officer then smashed Richard in the face with his gun. Richard hit the ground and a struggle began to arrest him. They were attempting to place him in handcuffs, but Richard tried to grab one of their guns. After an intense struggle, the officers were able to apprehend him. The vampire of Sacramento had finally been arrested. In Richard's possession upon being arrested was a .22 caliber pistol in the shoulder holster, David Meredith's wallet, and pictures of Evelyn Miroth and her son. This immediately tied him to the crimes, and police decided to search the apartment for further evidence, where they came across a horrific sight. Richard's apartment looked as if it was from a horror film. Everything within his home was covered in blood. Bones, animal parts, and human brain tissue were all discovered in the apartment. The blender Richard owned was stained in blood and reeked of decomposition. He owned books on anatomy, health magazines, and a classified section with every dog ad circled. Richard had a journal that was full of nonsensical ramblings and drawings of guns and swastikas. He was obsessed with Nazis and aliens due to a fear of being poisoned or captured by them. Out of all of the items discovered within Richard's apartment was a calendar. The calendar had dates circled saying, "Today." In total, there were 44 dates circled, including the dates of the Wallin and Miroth murders. The evidence against Richard was stacked, but he claimed to have only killed dogs. While behind bars, Richard wasn't treated well by other inmates. He had urine and fecal matter thrown at him. If he wasn't moved to a different cell, he would have potentially been killed. On March 24th, 1978, one final gruesome discovery was made. The body of a baby boy was found by a janitor inside a McDonald's McFries box near a church. Richard's trial would begin on January 2nd, 1979. He was being charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. He was facing the death penalty and pled insanity, but after 5 hours of deliberation, he would be found guilty. Richard would be sentenced to die in the gas chamber. However, Richard would not make it to the chamber after he was found dead in his prison cell. On December 26, 1980, Richard took a large amount of hoarded antidepressants and was encouraged to do so by fellow inmates. Richard Chase's story is one of disturbing mental decline, leading to a trail of blood. He is one of the closest real-life examples of a real vampire. His heinous crimes are enough to send chills down your spine and make you feel ill. Remember as you head to bed tonight to lock your doors. Good night, everyone.